Hello, welcome to the Kysor Video Tech School. My name is Steve, and this is one in a series of short videos that will introduce you, the heavy vehicle technician, to the latest in Kysor integrated technology. This video is an update on Kysor fan drive systems, and we'll talk about them in three areas. Overhauling the three current production fan clutches, realigning the fan clutches while they remain on the vehicle, and the important points of fan hub overhaul, including both the tapered roller and ball bearing varieties. Before we get into overhaul, let's briefly review current production fan drives. First, there are two varieties of hubs, the tapered roller bearing type and the ball bearing type. Second, there are three varieties of fan clutches, but they fall into two categories, the 8 horsepower and the 22 horsepower. This one is the 8 horsepower unit, and it is called the 7050. It can be recognized by the oval access holes in the front. Also, note that the air pressure tube is connected to the front of the cylinder. Now, these two are both 22 horsepower units. They look much the same, but none of their parts are interchangeable. That's because this one, the 8000, has its airline connected to the front of the cylinder, while its companion, the 8500, is mated to a special hub that allows the compressed air to go in here on the top of the bracket. Let's proceed to overhaul. Our technician is Martin from the Kysor Technical Service Department. He'll be doing the wrench work for us. All the clutches are removed from their hubs in the same fashion. Apply about 100 pounds of air pressure to the inlet port so that the clutch will disengage and can be rotated to allow access to the cap screws. Remove the 6 cap screws and the clutch will easily separate from the hub. On the 8500, this synthetic coupler connects the hub shaft and the clutch piston rod. Also, this O-ring seals the air passage between the hub and clutch. After the clutch is removed from its hub, it will be necessary to pressurize it again in order to remove the lining. On the 7050 and the 8000, a standard airline fitting may be used. For the 8500, you'll need to make up a hose that can be clamped over the end of the piston rod. While the clutch is pressurized, remove the hardware that secures the retaining plates. Remove the retaining plates and remove the lining. Note that the 7050, because its housing is die-cast aluminum, also has a lining wear plate that must be removed. After the clutch lining has been removed, the cylinder nut, tab washer, and cylinder must be removed. The engagement spring will cause the clutch to jump up a little as this is done. It is now possible to remove the cylinder. Note that the 8500 uses a stainless steel cylinder and that the tab washer is welded to it. Now that the cylinders are removed, you'll find that the inspection and overhaul procedures will vary between the three types of clutches. So when you do this on your own, it's important to follow the service guide. Inspect the inside of all cylinder types for evidence of scoring, as damage here will cut the piston O-ring and result in an air leak. Check all cylinders for cracks or deformation and clean them thoroughly. On the 7050, inspect this dust seal. Do not remove it unless there are pieces missing, as it is not included in the repair kit. Finally, on the 8000 and 8500, remove these O-rings and replace them with a new one from the repair kit. Lubricate the new O-ring with some of the grease recommended in the service guide. Next, lift the bearing housing from the shaft assembly. Closely inspect this ground surface on the shaft for signs of wear or brinelling. It forms the inner race for the main bearings, and any damage or wear in this area means that the main bearing is damaged and the fan clutch should be replaced. This used shaft shows acceptable wear in the bearing area. On the other end of the shaft is this surface which engages the inside of the lining. It is normal for this to be dark or blued or even lightly scored from contact with the lining. However, if it is heavily scored or cracked, then the fan clutch must be replaced. This U-shaft shows acceptable wear and discoloration in the lining area. Rotate the piston rod while feeling for roughness in the rear piston rod bearing. If found, or if the bearing is excessively loose, the piston rod and its bearing may be replaced as an assembly after removing the snap ring. However, if the bearing is okay, do not remove the piston rod assembly. Finally, remove the old engagement spring from the shaft assembly, as it will be replaced from the repair kit. Inspection of the shaft is now complete. The first thing to inspect on the bearing housing is the condition of the piston bearing. Rotate the piston while feeling for roughness. If found, the fan clutch must be replaced as this bearing is not serviceable. Remove the O-ring from the piston and the grease seal from the rear of the housing. These will be replaced from the repair kit. On the 7050 only, remove the O-ring from inside the piston. On the 8000 and the 8500, inspect this surface. Like the shaft, it is in contact with the outside of the lining and may show signs of this. However, it should not have any heavy scoring or cracking. If such damage is found, replace the fan clutch. On the 7050, however, the outer lining contact surface is replaceable by ordering a new wear ring. This used part shows acceptable wear. The last steps before reassembly involve cleaning and lubrication of the bearing housing. Let's start with the main bearing. Use a lint-free towel to wipe out as much of the old grease as possible. Then, put about this much of the recommended grease on a fingertip and work it into the bearing rollers. Use the shaft as shown here to help work the grease in. Next, install the new grease seal and lubricate its lip with some of the recommended grease. On the 7050, lubricate and install the small O-ring inside the piston. On the 7050 and 8000, lubricate and install the large O-ring on the outside of the piston. The 8500 uses a seal whose lip must face up. On the 8000 and the 8500, the small O-ring goes inside the rear of the cylinder. Use some grease to hold it in place. On all clutch types, install the new engagement spring and then place the spring end cap on top of it. An important note here is that if you have replaced the piston rod assembly on a 7050, you must use the new end cap that came with the assembly. The shaft may now be reassembled into the bearing housing. During this process, it is important to make sure the piston rod passes cleanly through the piston without catching. When this is achieved, place the assembly in a vise. Slowly close the jaws while squeezing the opposite side of the clutch. The idea is to apply even pressure as the shaft compresses the spring. Stop doing this when enough of the piston rod shows to reinstall the cylinder. The cylinder and piston rod must align as shown here so that the tab washer will engage the notch in the piston rod. Then install the nut and torque it to 84 pounds-inch. Connect the airline adapter and pressurize the clutch. On the 8000 and 8500, install the lining and the retaining plates and torque the hardware to 30 pounds-inch. If the clutch is a 7050, the procedure is a little different. Install the wear plate, the lining, and the retaining plate, but don't torque the hardware just yet. A special procedure must be followed to ensure that the wear plate is centered. The procedure is begun by drawing up only 4 of the retaining plate nuts and bolts to the point where they just make contact with the retaining plate and the clutch housing. The objective here is to hold the retaining plate against the clutch, but to allow it to move radially. Next, turn off or disconnect the air supply. This allows the clutch to engage. Because the wear plate and lining plate are not held tightly, they may move. The tapered shape of the lining forces the wear plate to center. Reapply air pressure and torque all the fasteners to 30 pounds-inch. Apply and release air pressure several times to ensure free operation. Also, while air pressure is applied, manually rotate the clutch as shown here to ensure there is no more than a slight drag from the lining and the bearings. That concludes fan clutch bench rebuilding, which should be done anytime the engine is overhauled, whether in or out of frame. However, it is not necessary in most cases to remove the fan clutch from the vehicle if all that's required is a simple reline. If there's enough room between fan clutch and pulley to remove the retaining plate bolts and the clutch has no air leaks, you may reline on the engine. A two-piece lining-only kit is available for all Kysor Dynair fan clutch models. Install the lining, then replace the retaining plate using procedures described earlier. Don't forget to center the wear plate if your clutch is a 70/50. Let's turn now to fan hubs, both the newer ball bearing type and the long-running tapered roller design. I'm sure you all understand basic overhaul procedures for the tapered roller bearing types, but what you may not be aware of is that Kysor has a new repair kit for these hubs. In the past, you were required to reuse the old bearing spacer during an overhaul. Today, the repair kit includes a service spacer and a selection of service shims. This allows you to set the end play. This is best done before final assembly, before any grease seals are installed, and with only oil on the bearings, no grease. Select the shim pack that will give you an end play from 1/1000th to 5/1000ths of an inch. Our preference is to get the end play down as close to 1/1000th of an inch as possible. When that's done, you can grease the bearings and complete the final assembly. Let's turn now to the ball bearing type hubs. There are two types. This one is used with front air inlet type clutches such as the 70/50 and the 8000. This one, though, is specific to the 8500 and has the air passage through the center of the bearing shaft. Let's look at the ball bearing hub used with the 70/50 and 8000 Dynair fan clutches. Overhaul begins by removing the dust cap. Be careful not to distort it, as it must be reused. Then, remove the 1 5/8 nut that secures the pulley to the base. The pulley may now be lifted clear as the bearings are a slip fit on the shaft. There is a spacer between the bearings and it will be used as part of the disassembly procedure. Use a punch to slide the spacer to one side. This will place it in a position where a press can be used through the front of the pulley to push against the spacer and drive the rear bearing out the back. Then remove the front bearing. Assembly is the reverse of disassembly, but it is absolutely essential that the spacer be somewhat loose between the bearings. As Martin is showing us, the rear bearing in this pulley has been pushed in just far enough. There is still sufficient room for him to get a 1 to 5/1000ths feeler gauge between the bearing and spacer. Finally, torque the retaining nut to 170 pounds-feet. Let's now take a look at the hub assemblies used with the 8500 fan clutch. Disassembly is a matter of removing the nut and then pushing the shaft out of the bearings. The bearing inner races have a snug fit on the shaft, and you may need a light press to do this. Several models of this hub use a one-piece double row bearing. After the snap ring is removed, it easily presses out. When pressing in the new bearing, make sure to push only on the outer race. The other styles of this hub all use individual front and rear bearings. To replace them, start by removing the snap ring. Then you'll need this tool to remove the rear bearing, a piece of 3/8 by 1 inch mild steel that is 2.5 inches long. Place the tool inside the rear bearing and lay it crosswise. Then you can push through the front bearing against the tool. After the rear bearing is out, the front bearing is simple to remove. Once the new bearings and snap rings are installed, the pulley may be replaced on the shaft. Remember that the front bearing inner race is a snug fit. Because of that, you'll need a hollow step plate like this one. It's available from Kysor, and the part number is in the service publication FH1. Place it over the front bearing and then press the pulley until the step plate contacts the end of the shaft. Caution, you must use the step plate or the bearings will be damaged. Finally, install the retaining nut and torque it to 175 pounds-feet. Replace the coupler and the O-ring, and you're ready to install the 8500 clutch back on the hub. This concludes our video on Kysor fan drives. Please remember that everything you saw here today is available in the form of service publications. Kysor Dynair fan clutches are covered in publication FC4. Kysor fan hubs and idler pulleys are explained in publication FH1. Good day, good luck, and keep them rolling.